Good evening. Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Paul Gordon. I am a professor and chair of political science. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural Mulford Q. Sibley public lecture. The purpose of this event is to celebrate the legacy of former political science professor Mulford Sibley, whose robust commitment to civil rights, civil liberties, civil disobedience, and free speech during the anti-communist hysteria of the 1940s and 1950s and the contentious politics of the 1960s and 1970s drew praise and condemnation both on campus and beyond. Dr. Sibley was also renowned for his commitment to environmental stewardship, sustainability, and the preservation of nature. Tonight, we acknowledge and celebrate both of those commitments. Three colleagues will help us do so. Political science professor August Nimps will share some comments and reflections on Professor Sibley's legacy. After that, Professor Nadine Strossen, Dr. Melinda Lindquist, and I will take up the topic of tonight's lecture: why should hate mongers and extremists have free speech rights? This question would have intrigued Dr. Sibley, and I'm sure he would have loved to have participated in this conversation. A couple of quick comments on my interlocutors. Professor Strossen is a New York Law School professor, Emerita, past president of the American Civil Liberties Union, and a prolific public speaker and writer. Her most recent book is entitled Hate: Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Dr. Lindquist is a professor of history and the College of Liberal Arts' first Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. In this role, she provides leadership on diversity, equity, inclusion, on racial justice and equity, and she works to strengthen the culture of DEI throughout the college, its policies, procedures, and practices. Our discussion will last approximately 45 minutes. We will then take questions from the audience for the final 30 minutes. But first, I will turn the stage over to my colleague, Dr. Nimps, to share his reflections on Mulford Sibley.
Thanks, Paul. First, I want to thank Paul, along with Alexis, Kyle, and other staff members in the political science department for making this event possible. When we had to cancel it, exactly 2 years ago, owing to the pandemic lockdown, it was not certain that we could ever do the event. Paul persisted, and we're all thankful. In the meantime, the university went ahead, as requested by our department, to name the space in front of the Social Science Building here on the West Bank campus, Mulford Q. Sibley Plaza. Mulford's embrace of a verdant environment is the reason for the naming. Anyone who can remember the barren concrete and brick appearance of that now also green oasis on the West Bank, well, right now it's not so green, in another month hopefully it will be, will appreciate his suggestion a half-century ago that trees be rooted there. It was Mulford, a member of the political science department from 1948 until 1982, an internationally renowned scholar who first proposed the trees and the benches that now grace the space. But Mulford is better known to an older generation of Minnesotans for another reason, and also relevant to the political moment in which we live today. Mulford, as far as I can determine, did more than anyone in the history of the University of Minnesota to successfully defend the right to free speech, the reason for this event. 4 decades earlier, another member of the political science department, William Shaper, lost that fight in the midst of the patriotic hysteria that accompanied World War I. A new patriotic hysteria emerged after World War II, sometimes known as the Cold War. Its apogee was in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, what the Cubans call the October crisis, the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. Anti-communism was rampant. Looking for a communist under every sheet or in every closet was the duty of every loyal American, we were told. Into this heady mix stepped Mulford. Unsatisfied with an editorial in the Minnesota Daily, the student newspaper, which failed, in his opinion, to stand up forthrightly against the communist hunters, Mulford penned his fateful letter to the paper in fall 1963, exactly a year after the missile crisis. Boldly and intentionally provocative, he wrote, quote, "I would like to see one or two communist professors on the faculty, plus a student communist club, the American Association for the Advancement of Atheism, a Society for the Promotion of Free Love, a League for the Overthrow of Government by Jeffersonian Violence, an Anti-Automation League, and perhaps a nudist club. We need students who challenge the orthodoxies, planting seeds of doubt and subversion, help to create moral and intellectual progress," unquote. As you can imagine, the word I can't say here, hit the fan. Time doesn't permit me to supply the details, but Mulford's letter provoked a fight with right-wing forces locally and nationally that lasted for almost 2 years, eventually reaching the state capitol and reported on by the New York Times in 1964. Just as importantly, but not well known, Mulford's colleagues defended him. Individuals who didn't necessarily agree with his opinions. Their solidarity was crucial in the inability of the communist hunters in getting him fired, unlike what happened with Schaefer 4 decades earlier. The support of coworkers, wherever we are employed, the important lesson, is indispensable in defending civil liberties. Mulford stood in the noble tradition of defenders of free speech going back to the abolitionists before the Civil War. For anyone today, especially youth, dissatisfied with the status quo, with the power hierarchy in place, having the right to defend their ideas in opposition to ruling elites is also indispensable. This is why the slave owners were such staunch opponents of free speech. Frederick Douglass, the leading black abolitionist, understood the issue better than anyone. His comment before the Civil War about opponents of free speech on both sides of the slavery question is most instructive. Quote, "It is idle and short-sighted to think only black people will be targets of this anti-free speech campaign. If today these parties can put down the right of speech on one subject, tomorrow they may do so on another. If they can prohibit the discussion of the rights of black men, then they may also, by and by, prohibit the discussion of the rights of white men," unquote. To oppose free speech was to be not just on the side of the slave owners. To do so could be dangerous to the anti-slavery cause. It could come back to haunt sincere opponents of slavery by giving an excuse to their opponents to shut down the political space to disseminate their ideas. Again, in Douglass's words, if today these parties can put down the right of speech on one subject, tomorrow they may do so on another, unquote. We're doing this event in order to know the history and wisdom I've just distilled. When I came on board to be a member of the department exactly 50 years ago, I didn't know Mulford's story, one that I should have known. Mulford made it possible for someone like me with my politics to be hired, and most importantly, to be tenured. When he wrote that he'd like to see one or two communist faculty members, little did he know that he might actually get one. Our effort here tonight is to make sure that history is known so that future department members, and most importantly, our students, know about it. It's a proud history that we should make available to the broader public, whatever their politics. I'll end with a note I got a week ago from retired colleague Ed Fogelman, who collaborated with Mulford more closely and longer than I did. Academics have a special responsibility for exposing lies and dispelling ignorance. In every professional discipline, it is what we are, or should be, trained and expected to do. It is entailed in our commitment to seek the truth, whether in physics or philosophy. It is embedded in our claim to academic freedom. No one better exemplified this responsibility than Mulford. In both the classroom and the public world, he was outspoken in exposing lies and dispelling ignorance. He spoke out publicly on some of the most contentious issues of his time, including war and social injustice. He was denounced for some of his ideas, including for views he never held, but he kept his faith in free speech as a bulwark of democracy. He remains an example to all of us. I wholeheartedly agree. I now look forward to the discussion between Nadine, Melinda, and Paul, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, August, for those very thoughtful reflections on Mulford's legacy. I'd like to begin our conversation with a question for you, Nadine. It seems that every month, free speech controversies erupt on college campuses across the country. Yesterday, the Washington Post ran an article about a speech Mike Pence is delivering, I think literally right now, at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. One line from that article summarizes the controversy this way, quote, "Some students say his rhetoric is dangerous, while others decry cancel culture and censorship." Nadine, can you share your thoughts about the state of free speech on college campuses today?
Well, thank you so much for that excellent question, Paul, and thanks to you and Melinda for sharing this conversation with me. Thank you so much, August, for those really inspiring comments, and including the quotes from Mulford and from Frederick Douglass. I think that the state of free speech on campus is not what I would like it to be, as somebody who is passionately committed to human rights, to equal justice, to full, robust rights for every single person, no matter who you are, no matter what you believe. You should be deeply engaged and empowered to participate actively, vibrantly in the discourse on campus, in the classroom, outside of the classroom, about academic topics, about topics of public concern. And every opinion survey, of which there have been many, continues to show that students, as well as faculty members, all across the ideological spectrum, are engaging in self-censorship. Now, self-censorship is not necessarily a bad thing. If you are about to utter a racist epithet and you self-censor, that's a good thing. But this goes far beyond that to people saying that they dare not make any comment at all about the most important subjects that are the most sensitive subjects, including race and gender. One of the most disturbing surveys I saw recently came from the Knight Institute just a couple of months ago, and it showed, again, completely across the ideological and identity spectrum, that people were engaging in what I call the negative kind of self-censorship. But there were two groups that felt more suppressed than any other group. And one was African American students, and the other one was conservative students. And I thought that's so interesting and disturbing. One group, obviously, an identity minority belonging to a group that has traditionally been marginalized and oppressed, and the other being an ideological minority on many campuses. But being an activist, I always am a congenital optimist, and I saw the opportunity here to perhaps begin to build gaps, build bridges across students that might not necessarily consider that they have that much in common with each other. So I just welcome, first of all, I'm so thrilled that Melinda is filling this important new position. I know the University of Minnesota is really committed to doing whatever it can to encourage and empower the fullest participation of diverse students, and I take that to mean diversity of views as well as diversity of identity. And I wish you all the best with that important work.
What about your feelings about free speech in the United States more broadly? So we focus so far on college campuses, where a lot of the controversy is. Do you see controversies at sort of a similar level in society writ large, or do you think this is an issue that's more concentrated on college and university campuses?
I would say the problem that I described is something that does exist in society at large, but let me also add another point, which is I always think of Charles Dickens' famous opening lines in A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It really is the best of times in terms of free speech law. So, you know, there was no free speech law for Frederick Douglass and the other abolitionists, and that definitely set their movement back. Douglass, I can't think of his exact words, so I'm not going to do justice to it, but he basically said, you know, a few months, or maybe even said a few weeks of free speech would be enough to break every chain and auction block in the South. And it's no coincidence that the United States Supreme Court began finally to strongly enforce the theoretical free speech that we had under the First Amendment since 1791, but like the guarantee of racial equality that existed since after the Civil War, it remained unenforced and unrealized until there were activists who got the court to actually uphold these rights, which existed on paper only. And it's no coincidence that it was in the cauldron of the civil rights movement when we had a Supreme Court that was very committed to racial justice, suddenly starting to put real teeth into the First Amendment free speech guarantee, because censorship was a major tool that was used to suppress civil rights activists. People might not know why Martin Luther King, for example, wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Why was he in jail? Because he was exercising or trying to exercise what we would now consider core political speech, advocating for constitutional rights and for civil rights. But not until the Supreme Court started to really put teeth into the First Amendment were those kinds of peaceful, nonviolent protests allowed. And the Supreme Court has continued to become more and more speech protective all across the very diverse justices, and we know that they disagree vehemently on so many issues. But on free speech, they're pretty much almost always 9-0 or 8-1. So free speech law is very, very strong. But that's not enough. Melinda and I were talking about this beforehand. It's one thing to have a legal right. I mean, that's the necessary precondition for free speech, but it's necessary but not sufficient. We need a robust free speech culture, and that includes especially giving education and technological and psychological and other resources to people who have systematically been deprived of them. So, Paul, in the general culture as well, even beyond the university campus, we find people saying that they are self-censoring, that they don't want to engage in controversial discussions because they are so fearful that they could be subject to extreme punishment, going way beyond criticism. And I'm all in favor of criticizing and rebutting and denouncing ideas you disagree with. People should be held accountable for their ideas. But I think the term cancel culture is rightly used to suggest a disproportionately harsh punishment that makes it so perilous for people to voice an opinion that they fear might be greeted with calls for them to be fired or to be expelled or to be ostracized from their friends. And yes, I defend people's free speech rights to advocate that somebody should be fired, but or even to boycott employers unless they will fire somebody. That's their free speech right. But we have a responsibility, I think, to use our free speech to urge people to please be a little bit more tolerant, a little bit more forgiving, to use the restorative justice approach and the rejection of overly harsh, overly punitive measures that we've rejected even when it comes to violent crimes. Why are we so harshly unforgiving for insensitive, offensive remarks? I heard a I want to engage in a conversation with that. Was that you, August? Oh, it was.
So how do we build, final question, and then we'll Melinda, you can jump in. How do educators, leaders, students, everyday people work to build a robust free speech culture? You mentioned the Supreme Court always comes down at 9081 in defense of free speech rights. People are obviously not, a lot of people are not taking cues from the court. When you look at public opinion data, support for free speech seems to kind of wax and wane, rise and fall over time. And it's been falling for some time in this country. So what steps can we take individually, in groups, collectively, to build a robust free speech culture?
And it really has to go beyond law, because when you, and I know that you're the expert on polling, and I look forward to hearing some of your data, but from the nationwide polls that I've seen, when you talk to students, for example, why do they feel chilled about discussing these important, but I should say important and sensitive subjects? It's not because they're afraid that the government is going to prosecute them. It's not because they're afraid that their professors are going to punish them. As a professor myself, I'm very pleased that students report, contrary to some of the negative attacks that are made unjustifiably, I think, on university professors, that students don't think professors are going to punish them if the student says something that the professor disagrees with. What they are afraid of is their peer pressure. So we have to try to build a kind of climate and culture that encourages students to be candid, to listen, empathetic, to speak respectfully, to have curiosity, to have empathy. And there are this is such a serious issue that universities around the country are starting various programs. And one that I read about recently at the University of Virginia is called the Moonshot, and it takes its name from Neil Armstrong's famous statement when he first set foot on the moon, and a one small step for man, one giant step for mankind, because they say you have to start very small, bringing literally two people together to have conversations with each other and build out from there. And they're using, some of you may be familiar with the StoryCorps program. They air on National Public Radio, and it started by bringing together people who know each other very well to share their conversations. And this is a spin on that by taking people who don't know each other at all, who have something in common. Let's say they both come from a certain part of the country, but they're otherwise very different on political issues. And there is an effort then to pair them, to engage in conversations and What we found in sociological studies have shown this. The famous contact theory that goes back to Harvard in the right after Gordon Allport, a famous social psychologist at Harvard, and that theory has been validated over and over and over again. It tallies with common sense, but it's nice to have the social science back it up. That the single most effective way to break down animosity or prejudice toward somebody, the other, somebody that you've othered, is to actually meet somebody in that category and interact with them as one human being to another. So this is a way of providing the opportunity. In this case, a lot of the othering is done not only around identity factors, but even more so, it seems that people are polarized in terms of ideology, that they would, it used to be that people were against interracial marriage. That has a huge support now, but people are very opposed to having their sons or daughters marry somebody of the opposite. And I think that term, the opposite, to me is kind of grating, the opposite political party. And there tends to be this notion that not only are you wrong, but you're evil for having those views. And so this is one small step, but multiplied, I think, is a promise, a promising way forward.
No, thank you so much for. I'm gonna turn the conversation in a slightly different direction. Though I have to say, a lot of what you just said is really resonating with me in a lot of ways. In terms of, we're having a conversation about free speech, but I think you're also pointing to the price of speech, and the price and the challenges that come along with authentic speech, vulnerable speech, and what are also the ideal spaces for that, right? So especially to the extent that those ideal spaces might be more intimate, where people can actually develop relationships, expose certain types of vulnerabilities, sort of build that sense of trust over time, and then have difficult, what people would call courageous conversations, I think is also a different type of process than what frequently happens in the classroom, right? The classroom is a very different type of space where the faculty member has their sets of priorities, the students have another set of priorities, right? And the ways that conversations get framed in those larger spaces, that space for those types of interactions strikes me as something that we would need to bring a sort of great intentionality to in terms of building them on that type of level. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation about this cultures of free speech that comes at great cost.
Can I comment?
With considerable bravery. Yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, everything you say is so generative. We were having this conversation beforehand. I feel as if it's continuing, and I look forward to continuing it even beyond tonight. But I mean, one of the things that I have realized so deeply as a result of constantly thinking and speaking and learning from others with whom I engage about speech is a point that you alluded to, Melinda, and I think it really bears emphasis, which is any time one of us speaks, there is at least a potential that we are having a negative impact on somebody else's free speech, right? That obviously happens if somebody engages in a hateful, racist epithet. That's probably going to chill the speech of people who have that racial identity. That's a really crude example. But even beyond that, if I voice an idea that some people find challenging or disagree with, that may well suppress their desire to participate in the conversation. So I think we always have to be mindful hopefully without engaging in such self-censorship that we abandon the effort to talk at all, that we always are conscious of conveying this is effective communication, right? It's what lawyers would call advocacy, other people would call rhetoric, that we try to frame our ideas in a way that is maximally designed to enable other people to comfortably and self-confidently participate in the conversation. And it's true for counter speech as well. Yes, they should feel free to criticize whatever I have said or whatever you've said, but hopefully in a way that wouldn't shut us up altogether, would enable us to respond and reply.
No, I mean, I agree. I think those are powerful points. And I think, right, it's about how we are framing ideas. And then I think in the campus space, it's how we are framing the space to have those conversations. And I think, right, also framing expectations so that students understand. One thing that I really appreciated was your pointing to, I think it's Ruth Simmons, in her inaugural address as the president at Brown University, and saying what we expect in the classroom, what we expect in this experience is that there is going to be discomfort, right? So what is sort of the charge?
Yeah.
The charge, I think, is to be able to speak with a certain type of honesty and integrity, to expect discomfort, to realize how one experiences discomfort so one can remain engaged, and also to understand that this is a point, right, in a long conversation where things are not going to be sort of concluded or closed, but we want to keep that space open. And I think it's thinking, I think, in the way you're describing about how do we create those spaces that allow for that vulnerability, allow for that humility, and also allow for repair when something has gone wrong. And
I'm not sure everybody knows who Ruth Simmons is, so if I may, she was the first African American president of any Ivy League university, and the first female president of Brown University. And this was quite a long time ago, in the early 1990s. And Brown already had a lot of speech suppressive incidents where, one example, but one of many examples, involved the student newspaper there that printed an editorial that was controversial. And so other students stole every single issue of that newspaper, and the faculty was actually backing the students who engaged in the theft, which some of us saw as suppressing free speech. And she came in absolutely determined to turn around that culture. And in her opening convocation address, her very first address in this historic capacity as Black female president of Ivy League University, and I remember this portion of her speech by heart. She said, "Education at its best is the antithesis of comfort." And she said, so if you've come here looking for comfort, go through yon iron gates. And she was basically saying, get out of here. But if you came to do better for yourselves and for your community, then stay and engage.
If I could jump in with a follow-up to a question or a phrase that Melinda used, sort of the price or the cost of free speech. The kinds of conversations that Melinda was talking about in the classroom, but more broadly, might be between, say, a liberal and a conservative, or an African American and a Caucasian, about some difficult issue that is kind of dividing them or separating them. But both speakers kind of come to that speech situation with a genuine commitment to try and learn and really see and hear the other side. But the arguments you make on behalf of free speech sort of go beyond that, right? The title of tonight's talk is, "Why Should Hate Mongers and Extremists Have Free Speech Rights?" I think we can understand if a liberal and a conservative, an African American and a white person are trying to have a genuine conversation, of course free speech should be allowed, encouraged. But can you sort of explain why we should extend an absolute right, a nearly absolute right to free speech, where speakers are coming to these conversations with no intention of having a genuine conversation in a reasonable space?
Paul, I have to put on my law professor hat when I answer this, and I know, Melinda, you were very interested in this aspect of my book as well, because, when you said almost absolute, that almost is a really important qualification. And part of the reason why free speech is so unpopular, according to many surveys, is that people don't understand what the concept of protected free speech actually is. There are a lot of distorted caricatured versions of it out there, including, oh, this free speech is absolute and it never allows any speech to be punished at all. And these free speech absolutists, including the ACLU and the Supreme Court, they don't recognize that speech does any harm. The answers are no, no, and no. Our law does robustly protect speech, including speech that some people consider to be hateful, and I'll come back and explain that qualification. But our law also does allow the punishment of an enormous amount of hateful speech. And, you know, actually, when you get right down to it, our law punishes the speech that is, including the hate speech, that is the most dangerous and the most harmful. And it also punishes or outlaws the censorship that is the most dangerous and the most harmful. So let me explain. You know, on the speech protective front, the Supreme Court has said that the bedrock principle is viewpoint neutrality or content neutrality. Government may never punish or restrict speech solely because of disagreement with, disapproval, even loathing of its viewpoint, its message, its idea. If you hate the idea, then respond to it, debate it, answer it back, ignore it, use your own powers of counter speech, but don't enlist the government, because we, the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, we wield the sovereign power in our democratic republic. It's not for the government to tell us which viewpoints are approved and which are not approved. It is for us to do that. And now I want to get back to that parenthetical, views that some people see as hateful. As August's eloquent introductory remarks underscored, Frederick Douglass's views were seen as hateful in his lifetime. Martin Luther King's views were seen as hateful in his lifetime. In our lifetime, you know, currently we are hearing not only members of the public, but government officials calling Black Lives Matter advocacy hate speech, terrorist speech, subversive speech. If you hand over to the government this inevitably subjective power to decide what speech is hateful, what ideas are hateful, what viewpoints are hateful and should be suppressed, it comes back to that exact point that you made, August. It may first be used against speech that you hate, but the next day or the next minute it's going to be used against ideas that you love. Now, conversely, our government, our legal system does, so that's the most dangerous form of censorship, right? Is government having the power to pick and choose which ideas or viewpoints are supported or suppressed. However, when you get beyond the content, the viewpoint, the message, the idea of the speech, and you look at it in its overall context, our law rightly says that if in particular facts and circumstances, the speech, whatever its message, including a hateful message, if it directly, imminently causes or threatens specific serious harm, then the speech can and should be punished. And that's often referred to as the emergency principle. The Supreme Court has recognized many categories of speech that satisfy the emergency principle, and much hateful speech is appropriately punished when it satisfies those categories. One example that's been in the news a lot since January 6th is intentional incitement of imminent, lawless, or violent conduct that's likely to happen imminently. So certain officials gave hateful, extremist speeches on January 6th, and many constitutional law experts, this hasn't yet gone to court, but many constitutional law experts are saying, you know, that constituted, in not just the hateful ideas, but in that context, intentionally incited imminent, lawless, and violent conduct, and therefore should be punished. Another example is what's called a true threat. And that's when the speaker is targeting a small group of people or an individual and intends to instill a reasonable fear That means not a subjective fear of a thin-skinned person, but a reasonable fear that you're going to be subject to attack. And notice that it's not necessary that the speaker actually intends to carry out the attack. It's enough that the speaker instills a fear, because that already suppresses the targeted individual's freedom of movement. And if I can just give a concrete example of that, Paul and Melinda, August 2017, Charlottesville, you already referred to Charlottesville, and you know the horrific ideas and viewpoints of unite the right. You will not replace us. Jews will not replace us. I'm the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and I can't repeat that phrase no matter how many times without my hair standing on end. But I do agree that the loathsome, repugnant viewpoint of that message is not alone enough to justify censoring it, because I know that views that I like have also been considered loathsome by other people. But when you get beyond the viewpoint and you looked at the overall context, and they were not only uttering those repulsive words, but they were doing so while marching menacingly toward the counter demonstrators who were massed around the statue of Thomas Jefferson at the center of campus and brandishing lighted tiki torches in their faces. That constituted a punishable true threat. So I think our law is very sensible, and I probably wandered quite far from the core of your question, but I think it's really important for people to understand that neither I, nor much more importantly, the Supreme Court, is saying all hate speech should be protected. No, a lot of it should be punished. I'm just nervous about giving the government more latitude beyond the emergency context to punish viewpoints.
Maybe I'll ask another legal question. So, do public and private sector employees have the same freedom of speech rights? For example, do either or both have the same First Amendment right to express discriminatory sentiments in their workplaces? And does a publicly funded institution have legal obligations to ensure that taxpayers can access their institution without being subject to discriminatory speech?
So this is very complicated because there are distinctions not only between the public sector and the private sector, but there are also distinctions between categories of employees, especially here on a university campus. Faculty members and students and others who are engaged in the academic enterprise have special academic freedom type free speech rights that other employees don't have. So first, Melinda, you give me an opportunity to make a point that is really not nearly as well known as it should be, which is the First Amendment free speech guarantee, along with most other constitutional guarantees, only applies to the government. You have no constitutional rights against any private sector entity, including a private sector employer. That's not to say you don't have other legal rights that can be protected by statute, by contract, but you have no First Amendment free speech rights. And unfortunately, in this country, employees in the private sector have all too few rights under any sources of law. I know you agree with that, August. And we have what's called employment at will in just about universally in this country, which basically means an employer can fire or discipline or somehow punish employees for any reason or no reason, with very few exceptions. And these exceptions would include, thanks to civil rights laws, you may not do so based on racial, gender, or other specific categories of discrimination. But virtually all states, and certainly the federal government, don't protect against discrimination on the basis of ideas or viewpoints. So essentially, if you're a private sector employee, you basically don't have any free speech rights at work. And it even goes beyond that in the sense that employers are now punishing employees for what they say completely outside of the workplace, namely on social media, on their own devices, on their own time, to their own social media friends and colleagues. And this has not really been litigated, but I think that there's a great deal of discretion that's being accorded to employers, and I think it's a very, very concerning because it becomes basically a potential 24/7 monitoring of everything that everybody says as the price of having a job. That's very concerning, not only from the perspective of individual liberty, which is very important, but also from the perspective of a democracy. As the Supreme Court said very eloquently, when the speech is about matters of public concern, it is more than a matter of individual self-expression. It is the essence of self-government. So when you have employers basically, monitoring and disciplining and punishing employees for social media posts about public controversies, that's deeply damaging to our democracy. In the public sector, the Constitution does apply, so public sector employees have some First Amendment rights, but the Supreme Court has said, and I think this basically does make sense in fairness, that the point of a public workplace is to get the job done. It's not to serve as a forum like the proverbial town square to debate all public issues. And so the Supreme Court has said that restrictions that are put in place on speech in order to further the efficiency of the workplace are constitutionally permissible. It's a little bit more complicated when the public workplace is a state university, as we're here at the University of Minnesota, and the employees are faculty members who are engaged in the educational process. There, the court rightly has recognized this concept of academic freedom, which means respecting the autonomy of the professors, consistent with their independent professional judgment, to decide what will be taught, how it will be taught, who will be admitted. By the way, this has been the basis for upholding racial and other affirmative action programs at universities, is because of this concept of academic freedom. One of the components is the discretion and judgment of those who run the university, including faculty members, to determine who will be members of that community, both students and faculty members.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to when you were sort of setting up the speech that is sort of free, but also the pieces of that speech that are also punishable and not protected. So it's my sense that you do not oppose the standard that distinguishes speech that elicits direct harm at the level of the specific targeted individual. But you are highly suspicious of a concept of group defamation. With respect to the latter, the research that you mention asserts that the range of responses to hate speech, and you do the quotes with the hate speech throughout, because you're suspicious, right, of course, of the term, directed at the group are always speculative, highly unpredictable, based upon the individuals involved. Yet the latest research on microaggressions, speech that I think most would not suggest rise to the level of hate speech, produces immediate as well as long-standing health effects. Given what we know about hurtful speech, what are our obligations, if any, to protect not only the individual, but the group, which is composed of individuals, from this type of speech? And do institutions have any obligations to act as intermediaries, especially in the group spaces, so the classroom, other types of campus spaces that we create, that create opportunities for this exchange of ideas, but also exchange of potential harm?
And thank you so much, Melinda. You've packed a lot into there, so I may not do justice to every single aspect of this really important question, but what I think the most important part of the important question is to stress that neither I, nor much more importantly the Supreme Court, is skeptical of added censorship. And from now on, I'll use the term censorship to mean any additional power to suppress hate speech beyond the substantial power that appropriately exists under current law. The resistance to censorship is not at all based on this fallacy that speech can do no harm. Even speech that falls short of the emergency standards certainly, at least potentially, can do harm, and in many cases actually does. But in order to justify censorship, you have to answer more than, does this speech cause harm actually or potentially? Logically, you would also have to be able to show, to answer the following questions, does the censorship do any harm? Is there any non-censorial measure that we could take that would be at least as effective and perhaps even more effective to redress the harm? And harmful as speech is, I continue to be convinced that speech that doesn't satisfy the emergency principle does less harm than government censorship to punish speech because of harm short of that standard. And the reason I say continue to, because I'm always looking for evidence of, how does censorship work in the other countries that have it? How did it work in this country before we had such a strong protection of free speech? And one of the things that I discovered in doing the research for my book is how human rights activists all over the world have opposed censorship of hate speech. Not at all, because they have strong free speech protections under their own laws. They don't. They have anti-hate speech laws, but because they have found that the censorship is at best ineffective in promoting the goals, which I totally share, of equality, dignity, diversity, inclusivity, societal harmony, censorship at best is ineffective, at worst is counterproductive. So, let me give a couple of reasons which will sound familiar to you. One is that censorship is intended to mute the message, right, to silence it or at least make it quieter, less accessible, but in fact, it usually has exactly the opposite impact. There are so many terms to describe this phenomenon, including the forbidden fruits effect. Sometimes it's called the Streisand effect, because a number of years ago, Barbara Streisand tried to suppress images of her Malibu home that were being posted online, and suddenly hundreds of thousands of people who were not interested in looking in that photograph were looking at it. We saw this in the Weimar Republic in Germany, during which Hitler rose to power. There were very strict anti-hate speech laws at the time. They were very strictly enforced, including against Nazis, and the Nazis loved it. These were propaganda platforms and opportunities for them, which replicated, obviously, all of the harm that was coming from their expression. Now, why is it at even worse, often counterproductive? And that's because when you have this subjective standard, either that government may repress speech based on a despised viewpoint, or let's say you ratchet in the emergency standard, so you give the government more latitude when speech might indirectly, potentially, at some future point cause harm. We used to have that standard in this country, and we called it the bad tendency test. And it was under that test that not only abolitionists and civil rights activists were suppressed, but communists and socialists and anarchists and anybody who was agitating for social change. Why? Their speech was seen, well, of course that might lead to insurrection. It might lead to overthrowing the United States government. And so I think, and so when you have that additional latitude and these subjective concepts of hate speech, the government enforcers necessarily have essentially unfettered discretion. And what would we predict in a society where we have documented structural endemic racism in the civil justice, civil legal system, the criminal legal system, when we have well-documented implicit or unconscious bias on the part of individuals? I mean, thank goodness we're struggling to overcome these forces, but in the meantime, why in the world would we hand over to these systems this inherently discretionary, boundless, manipulable power? Predictably, it is going to be used disproportionately against those who are members of minorities, both political minorities and identity minorities, the dissidents, those who are challenging the status quo.
Yeah, and I mean, if that's an argument, I mean, it's one of the strongest arguments that you make, right? It's really like it's nearly impossible to write hate speech laws that actually manage to offer protections to the groups that those laws are seeking to protect. And you hinge a lot of your argument on that. And so I'm going to just begin by asking, the counterfactual is, if a hate speech law could be written such that it actually would manage to offer the protections in the ways that, and not be, as you point out in so many cases, right, instrumentalized, in fact, against those same populations. So you have a number of examples thinking about, right, campuses and the use of codes, and then the ways in which, you know, those codes of conduct then become marshaled against largely BIPOC communities on those campuses, even though the intention is to do something that's different from that. So if it was possible, would you be convinced to sort of rethink some portions of your argument? If
it wouldn't even be rethinking the argument. The facts would fit into the legal rubric. So again, both I and, again, much more importantly, the Supreme Court do not absolutely oppose any additional restriction on speech. We say if it can satisfy the emergency principle, it's constitutionally permissible and appropriate. Another rubric that's often used in our legal system, let me trot that out. If there are any law students or lawyers here, this will sound familiar to you. It's called strict scrutiny. That is, any restriction on speech is presumptively, but not automatically, unconstitutional. It will be constitutional if the government can satisfy the burden that's called strict scrutiny, and that means the courts are taking a close look at it. The government can demonstrate that the restriction is necessary to promote a countervailing goal of compelling importance. Clearly, equality, diversity, dignity, these are all clearly goals of compelling importance, of equal constitutional stature to free speech. So the difficult question is the restriction even effective in promoting those important goals, let alone is it necessary? Is it the least speech restrictive alternative? And if that could be satisfied, I would definitely support the added restriction. In fact, I wrote an entire chapter in my book, which I'm really disappointed I haven't had much discussion of. It's a chapter that basically challenges the reader to design a hate speech code that would be constitutional. I go through all of the different elements that are in a typical law. You know, who should be the groups that are protected, what should be the mental intent on the part of the speaker, what should be the impact, the harm that you would look for. I quote my longtime ACLU colleague and friend, Eleanor Holmes Norton. Some of you may know she's been the longtime non-voting representative of the District of Columbia in Congress. She was the first African-American woman to chair the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And many, many, many years ago, Eleanor, who's a passionate crusader for civil rights, said it's impossible to write a hate speech code that doesn't end up punishing words that none of us civil rights activists would want to see punished. It's been tried and tried and tried. So I call this the Eleanor Holmes Norton challenge. I've said to people who read the book, if you can come up with something that I think satisfies that standard, I told Eleanor I'll send it to her and see if she will eat her own words.
I
Thank
could
you.
jump in maybe with one final question for you, Nadine, and then we'll open it up. We're kind of at time for Q&A, but the defense you're making of free speech, perhaps this is an uncharitable or unfair characterization, so correct me if it is, but in essence, it's sometimes the defense of strong free speech rights, absent kind of an emergency situation, come down to strong defense of free speech is better than censorship. It's better than the alternative. The alternatives are worse.
That's
Censorship
exactly right.
is ineffective, potentially counterproductive. And so that's kind of an avoid harm defense. Is there kind of a more positive way to defend sort of the positive side of free speech? We've talked a lot about the alternatives being worse.
Yeah.
What are the justifications, the positive justifications for strong free speech?
Oh,
rights?
thank you so much for that, Paul. And you're absolutely right that because especially in a context like this, where students wonderfully are so concerned about equality and justice and dignity and racial justice, they're usually concerned about the harms or the potential harms of speech, which is why I do sincerely have that emphasis. I really want to make clear that I do understand the harms here. And so I often think of Winston Churchill's famous aphorism about democracy. It's the worst form of government except for all the others. You know, speech is really dangerous, but it's just less dangerous than the alternative. But free speech has such a positive, affirmative dimension and liberating for the individual, egalitarian for those especially who have been suppressed in every sense, not only their voices literally, but their lives more generally, and it's an indispensable engine for democracy. You know, the Supreme Court has recognized what philosophers throughout history have recognized, and not only philosophers. If you look throughout human history, there's been such an impulse toward free speech. A friend of mine recently wrote a book that traces the history of free speech and censorship as far back as records go. And there seems to be this burning desire of speech having an instrumental purpose, which I've talked about, and that is to express your ideas, to communicate with other people, to create a self-government and you know, fuel the self-government, we the people holding those we elect accountable to us. But it also has an intrinsic value of helping to define who you are, what your identity is. You know, we use the word identity so often today, but how much of it is reflected in how we express ourselves. Descartes had that famous statement, I think, therefore I am. The Supreme Court said, you know, speech is, the beginning of freedom is thought, and speech is the beginning of thought. So you put those together and it comes out, I speak, therefore I am. And I think, you know, here in an academic setting, it's also really important to affirm and celebrate the truth-seeking function of speech. It is not guaranteed that truth is going to emerge from this marketplace of ideas or from academic freedom, but it's absolutely guaranteed that truth will never emerge from censorship.
Thank you, Nadine. Why don't we open it up for questions now? So we will have colleagues coming down with microphones, and then if you've got a question, just hold up your hand, and then should I take the liberty of calling?
Oh, please.
So. So go ahead, Ron, our first question.
I spent more than 30 years working with television news journalists, which began before cable news existed, when we actually had a fairness doctrine. And against that backdrop, I've come to regard media, broadcast cable, social ownership management, as villains in the process of creating divisiveness and polarization in our society. And so how do the actions and the rights of those organizations match up with the need for free speech?
Really interesting question, especially because I gather that you're talking about traditional media and because most people now are, including those in the traditional media, are very often demonizing the social media. Now, you know, the complicating factor is that all of these media, first of all, have no constitutional obligation to protect our free speech, right? It goes back to that basic but relatively unknown point that I mentioned earlier, that private sector entities are not bound by the Constitution. So we have no free speech rights when it comes to any media, traditional or online. Moreover, they, as communications entities, appropriately have their own free speech rights, which include the right to include or exclude any speaker, any idea that they choose. So when we don't like how they are using that enormous power, and we think it's doing damage to individual liberty and equality and democracy and other values we hold dear, our remedies have to be through changing the culture, through more free speech, through the encouragement of other media that are going to give better treatment. And here I think that the internet gets too much of a bad rap, or let me put it this way, that I think the younger generation, bless you, take for granted the enormous positive aspects of social media that I, being much older, will never take for granted. So it used to be said quite rightly, and it was a famous journalist of the 20th century who said very disparagingly of the First Amendment, well, you know, freedom of the press only belongs to those who are wealthy enough to own a printing press. In other words, almost nobody. And yet, thanks to the advent of social media and other technology, a huge percentage of the entire global population essentially has the power of the printing press, right? And can communicate, almost every person in the world can communicate with literally almost every other person in the world. And that has facilitated not only hate mongering and extremism and terrorist speech and disinformation and a lot of negative speech, but let's not lose sight of the enormous positive social movements that have been engineered and fueled thanks to this new technology. I mean, the ACLU has been crusading against police abuse as far back as I can remember, and yet the Black Lives Matter movement and the movement, you know, serious groundswell of efforts to restrain police abuse really only took off thanks to the power of social media. Likewise with the Me Too movement. I mean, certainly throughout my entire adult lifetime and long before, there were efforts to harness opposition to and punishment against sexual abuse and sexual harassment, but the Me Too movement really took off and had an impact, including on law, thanks to social media. So many candidates for public office who could not have afforded the enormous cost of advertising over broadcast, which used to be required, were able to campaign successfully thanks to the relatively cheap social media. You know, young candidates, female candidates, minority candidates, and so there's a lot of positive, and hopefully there will be entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs who will constantly be creating new media outlets that will repair divisions rather than deepen them.
There's a guy over here. Hi there. I know you touched on this in the last question, but I wonder if you could delve more into your thoughts on free speech and how it relates to social media. I know these private companies are certainly under no constitutional obligation to guarantee free speech, but I kind of get the feeling that a lot of people in this country feel as if they have no freedom of speech rights, like the right to
Yeah.
saw like Section 230 reform or some other, I don't know, venue.
It's a very serious problem because there is enormous power that is not constrained by the Constitution. And you mentioned Twitter. Twitter's terms of service it says it very bluntly, but it's a description of all of them. And Twitter says, literally, we can kick you off our platform for any reason or no reason. And when Donald Trump was kicked off deplatformed from both Twitter and Facebook, I and the ACLU were deeply disturbed by that. Not that our hearts were necessarily bleeding for Donald Trump, who has the resources and the connections to create his own platform or go elsewhere. But as we said in our press release at the time, we're concerned about our BIPOC and other, marginalized clients. They don't have those alternatives, and they are subject to the whims of these tech giants. Think about it. At the time, I remember saying that at the time, Donald Trump still was president of the United States and commander-in-chief. And nonetheless, I think there was a good case that Mark Zuckerberg was more powerful than Donald Trump. Think about it. Donald Trump was subject to not being reelected, and he wasn't reelected. Zuckerberg isn't subject to that kind of restraint. Donald Trump was subject to being impeached, and he was impeached twice. Zuckerberg isn't subject to impeachment. Donald Trump could be sued for violating the First Amendment, and he was sued for violating the First Amendment. Zuckerberg can't be sued for violating the First Amendment. Trump was subject to all kinds of other checks and balances under our Constitution, including due process constraints. None of those apply to Mark Zuckerberg. So we have to find other mechanisms of restraint. And the good news is that very creative, thoughtful, intelligent scholars in many disciplines have been, kicking about and investigating a whole range of possible solutions. And some of them are making their way into Congress. I deeply oppose any heavy-handed direct content censorship by Congress, and we're hearing proposals from both sides of the aisle, which is just a recipe for viewpoint discrimination. You know that if it comes from the Republicans, they're going to say that the social media companies may not discriminate against conservative perspectives, but if it comes from the Democrats, the opposite, and don't take my word for it, look at some of the proposed legislation, but some that I think really bears investigation, and I'm not going to be more definite than that, because these matters are so complicated. Even people who, especially people who work full-time on these issues, are just making tentative proposals saying this is something that's really worth investigating. And one is an antitrust approach that would offer alternative, that kind of goes to the first question as well, offer alternative platforms that, in my ideal world, we would have user empowerment, user freedom of choice, no matter who we are and no matter what our values are. We could find platforms that would be consistent with our own personal choices. Another alternative that surprisingly diverse array of experts are advocating, including conservatives and libertarians who are usually skeptical of government regulation, but many of them are saying we ought to consider treating these giant platforms as regulated public utilities, essential infrastructure, as the landline telephones were treated, or the telegraph, or the railroads, that you can't function in modern society without them, so that they should be subject to basic requirements of fair and non-discriminatory treatment toward everybody. So that's another possibility. Something that I think is really worthy of consideration is very strong transparency requirements and sort of privacy protections. So, because from the intelligence we have, and we have very little information, but it seems that we are constantly being subject to the most pervasive, granular surveillance. One book that I highly recommend if you haven't yet read it is Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. It's a very long book and very frightening. And she has a lot of evidence that even those of us who are not customers, who don't belong to some of these platforms, are nevertheless being surveyed at the most granular level and then being manipulated in terms of the information that is driven to us without even our knowledge about the algorithms that are choosing what information we see and what we don't see, let alone our consenting to it. And to me, that is the antithesis of freedom of speech. The essence of freedom of speech, which includes the right to choose what information we receive, as well as what we convey. The essence is individual freedom of choice. And we don't even know. We are the objects. We are not the subjects. So I would look very favorably on some attempt to protect our privacy and give meaningful consent to both the surveillance and what we receive. Just a few ideas.
I believe I saw a hand here earlier. Did you want to?
I was just wondering how you felt about removing the liability protection of some of these platforms. I think it's
Section 230, which was also referred to. I think that would do much more harm than good, because the reason that protection was put in place was to create a disincentive to remove any speech that is controversial, right? If they are liable for third-party content, then they're going to bend over backwards, in favor of taking off even more, right, rather than face liability. And so I think that if we want to create, realize the potential of enabling as many of us as possible to voice as many perspectives as possible.
Silicon Valley is using content discrimination. Well,
They could still do that even without Section 230. They have a First Amendment right to do that. The statute doesn't add to that.
and get satisfaction.
No, you wouldn't because of the First Amendment. So they have an editorial right as, private sector communications platforms, just the way the New York Times does, to decide that they don't want a certain speaker or they don't want a certain viewpoint. That's because of the First Amendment.
Lawsuits against newspapers. I hear Carl Rittenhouse is going after the people that demonized him.
That's defamation, but that's because the newspapers are engaging in, precisely because they are very selective about what they publish or what they don't publish. The idea of these platforms was we don't want them to be such centralized, strong gatekeepers, right? We don't want it to be as difficult for you or me to have our ideas published. Maybe you can get your ideas published easily in the New York Times, I can't. So it should be easier for us to have access to these platforms, and we create an incentive for them to allow us by giving them the liability shield.
Nick,
Yeah, so
and if everyone could project, since we don't necessarily have the mics going on.
so in Professor Gordon's class, we were shown that when polls are given anonymously, people are less likely to self-censor. And so given that in the context of this conversation today, that self-censorship is seen as a negative, do you think it were possible in some way, maybe perhaps using technology to facilitate anonymity in the classroom, that it would be something worth pursuing? Or is that just a Band-Aid on a larger issue?
That's a really interesting question. And I'm trying to imagine what the classroom would be like if it were, it would.
No, I mean, this is technology that I think, especially in the pandemic, right? If you think back to some of your classes where there were anonymous polls. I mean, anonymous polls I think can be great, especially getting students to be vulnerable, ask that question that half the class has, but everybody is reticent to ask. And then before Zoom, I mean, there definitely have been different types of clickers that faculty have used in classrooms. And so I think that is a way to open up the conversation, at least the conversation between the student and the faculty member. I don't know that it necessarily does that work of the conversation among the students. But
that's really, really helpful. I hadn't thought about that other context. And Zoom moves in the opposite direction, right, by creating this permanent record of, you feel like you're not only are you exposed to everybody in the class, but to everybody in the world, right, through the virality of it. And you're making me recall that one technique that some professors have used is to require that students not use any recording at all, and that they promise that, the famous pledge, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, what happens in the classroom stays in the classroom. I'm not sure, it would have to be probably a pretty small class that already trusted each other in order to take that seriously.
Question back here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, you mentioned in one of your previous answers that the essence of free speech was to be able to seek out the information that you wanted and to convey it, in a sense, however you wanted. Is that correct? Am I misinterpreting that, or?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I'm trying, am I looking at the speaker? I'm really having trouble because of the lights.
right here.
Oh, right, sorry, yeah.
I guess my question kind of is if that should be the ethos that we use free speech for, because especially now
So I'm so sorry, can paraphrase me again?
Sorry, because you mentioned that the essence of free speech is the ability to find the information that you are seeking and convey it.
Yes.
My question might be a bit esoteric, but
Sure.
Is that the essence that we should be going for instead of in essence that is based in decency? Because much of the information that we just seek to convey or find on our own terms, just whatever we want to do, is kind of both against what most academic fields kind of strive for, which is usually done through peer review, which is faulty, but what is the alternative? And often just goes against basic decency for people. And I feel that can kind of be exploited. So my question is, if we should be trying to reach for a thing of where we can say whatever we want instead of thinking about what we should say.
Thank you very, very much. The fact that we have a right to say something doesn't mean it is right to say it. And I think I said this earlier, but let me underscore it, that self-censorship is often a very positive thing. I used a very crude example. If you're going to, rather than use a racial epithet, you should self-censor. But even beyond that, you should communicate the idea in a way that is maximally respectful of the other person, maximally likely to make them feel comfortable and included and to participate in the discussion. So freedom of speech includes freedom of choice, and that is what not to say or how to say our idea, how to convey it in a way that is effective and respectful and decent and courteous and civil. Where I think self-censorship goes too far is if you're just not addressing an entire topic or honestly and candidly conveying your true opinion because you believe the opinion itself people are going to find insulting. And that may well be the case, but I think it really reduces the richness of our dialogue as well as individual liberty to self-censor to that great an extent. And I'm sorry if anything I said seems inconsistent with the notion of peer review. To the contrary, I very, very strongly support and it's one of the reasons why I'm leader of this organization called the Heterodox Academy, which was founded by a group of social scientists, not because they supported freedom of speech in the abstract, but because they saw that having just a uniformity of views among their professional peers, their social science peers, was undermining the quality of their research. Because when you have people with different perspectives and different views that are more critical of yours, you are likely to do a better job yourself. And that's why I truly welcome the really hard questions that I get, because it helps me to refine and hopefully improve my ideas. So to me, that's a really important exercise of free speech, is to be subject to criticism, including peer review.
Yes, so I've been listening. I think it's very challenging. One thought that comes to mind is, are we becoming a more authoritarian society where people are afraid to say what they want? They have deference to authority. I think that's what I see personally, that authority counts, and what you think is not acceptable unless it's in agreement with authority. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. As I said earlier, and I'm really interested to hear if any of Paul's polls verify this or are consistent with it, that most people seem rightfully not to be so afraid of authority as they are of their peers, with some exceptions. I really have to say, the ACLU, including here in Minnesota, has had many cases where we are coming to the defense of peaceful, non-disruptive protesters who were suppressed and punished by the police unjustifiably, including journalists, including observers of protests. So certainly that kind of abuse by authority, and the pipeline protesters and others. But there we have the First Amendment on our side, and we can win those cases. But when you're silencing yourself or your message is suppressed because you're afraid of cancel culture, being fired by your boss in the private sector, being ostracized by your peers, there is no First Amendment remedy.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this really enlightening discussion. And I myself have been struggling over the past number of years with the idea of free speech. And I have to, full disclosure, I was a NYU law grad, so kudos to you. I have a special feeling for my alma mater and you as well, so thank you for being such a wonderful representation of our university.
Thank you.
But I am struggling with the idea of free speech versus fraud speech, because I think what I've been seeing, there is so much disinformation. Should people feel so free, and should speech that is dishonest and misleading and patently not true, should people feel so able, at the same time we're sort of censoring ourselves, people almost feel too free to speak that way. And I feel like that's definitely something that two forces struggling against each other. I was hoping you could address that, and how can we actually explain free speech to people in general, or maybe change the cultural concept, because that's speech that costs our society so much when these lies, the pervasive lies, are just exploding all over the place. And it makes me feel, as much as I feel so passionate about free speech, sometimes it worries me that it's a dangerous, slippery slope. So if you could address that. Thank you.
And thank you very much. And my answer is basically the same with respect to disinformation or misinformation. And why don't we throw into the hopper extremist speech or terrorist speech as hate speech? And often these are the big three that people are understandably concerned about. But the problem with all of them is when you talk about slippery slope, the slippery slope of empowering government to go beyond certain existing categories of unprotected lies or misleading information, right? So it is important, as I said about hate speech, to recognize that we have certain categories of lies that are already punishable. One you mentioned is fraud, but that's when the speaker intentionally makes a false representation of fact, intending somebody to rely on it. They rely on it to their detriment. They suffer tangible injury. Another example is perjury. You lie in a court of law, and that leads to a miscarriage of justice. Another example is defamation. You intentionally lie about somebody, harming that person's reputation, causing them tangible injury. You go beyond that to the slippery concept of disinformation, fake news, misinformation, and it's like hate speech. One person's gospel truth is somebody else's disinformation. And in fact, even the same person, even the very same scientific body we see, one day is reaching one conclusion about masks or the lab leak theory, or take any other COVID controversy, as new information comes in, as new analysis comes in. And most of the examples that I dare say that you're talking about, if not all of them, are not straightforward matters of objectively verifiable or falsifiable fact, right? It's a matter of interpretation, analysis, opinion. I agree with the Supreme Court when it said in our system, there's no such thing as a false idea. Ideas have to be fought out in the realm of the marketplace. The court also has said we have no use here for Oceana's Ministry of Truth, which goes back to George Orwell's 1984. And again, I have to say, it's like a broken record, dangerous as even, non-perjury, defamation, fraud, misleading speech is. Empowering the government to decide that this disinformation is going to be punished is very dangerous. We can think of how that term has been used by various government officials. There are many countries around the world that have passed laws against disinformation, especially in the wake of the pandemic. It even happened in our country. Puerto Rico passed 2 such laws. And guess what? All of these laws are consistently enforced to suppress anybody who dissents from or criticizes the government's COVID policies, whatever they might be. So I have to keep coming back to the old saw of we've got to correct misinformation with disinformation. Education, 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 critical media skills and analysis. Just as the internet gives us unparalleled resources for spreading disinformation, it also gives us unparalleled resources for ferreting it out, right? For doing our own research, for going to trusted fact checkers, to going to original sources.
Well, I feel like the conversation could continue, but to respect everyone's time, I'd like to just sort of end with some concluding comments. If you're fascinated and engaged with this topic, I highly recommend reading Nadine's book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It, with Free Speech, Not Censorship. Copies are available outside. And finally, I'd like to just thank you for wonderful questions. I'd like to thank August for his fantastic introduction and summary of Dr. Mulford Sibley's legacy. Melinda and Nadine, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you, all of you. Thank all of you. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. That was such an interesting question. I hadn't even thought about the anonymous claim.
Wait, say that again?
The question about the anonymous, because I was thinking of it. How would
Recording stopped.